The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and old wood polish, the scent curling in the heavy air like a memory no one wanted to disturb. Sunlight strained through stained glass windows, casting muted colors across the worn pews where mourners sat shoulder to shoulder, dressed in stiff black suits and faded dresses. A sacred hush wrapped around the room, broken only by the soft sniffles and the rustling of tissues. At the front, resting side by side on a velvet-draped table, were two urns, one a gleaming silver, the other a soft pearl white surrounded by framed photographs of Edward and Lillian Carter, the beloved pillars of the community, smiling, laughing, holding hands, saints in the eyes of all who knew them. But the mourners' attention was no longer on the urns. From the very back of the chapel, almost unnoticed at first, a figure stepped from the shadowed doorway into the soft, fractured light. Her skin was a deep, rich brown that caught the gold-red hues from the stained glass and seemed to glow with a quiet, steady fire. Her black dress was simple, unadorned, no lace, no sequins, a garment of pure dignity. Her hair was pulled back into a soft, low puff, framing a face that was still and composed, like water in a deep, hidden lake. There was no grand entrance, no theatrical pause, only the slow, deliberate steps of a woman who had learned to move without asking permission. Elena Carter, the adopted daughter no one had spoken of for years, unless they had to. The name that never made the Christmas cards. The face absent from the family albums proudly displayed on coffee tables. Murmurs stirred like a soft wind through the chapel. Is that her? I didn't know she was coming. They hadn't spoken in years. Right? Elena heard them, but gave no sign that she did. She had grown up in the spaces between whispers, learned how to walk through rooms where her presence made the air too tight. Today, she wore that skill like armor. Her gaze swept across the gathered crowd, the distant cousins, the church friends, the colleagues who thought they knew the Carters well. Some turned away quickly. Others stared openly, curiosity flickering behind veils of politeness. For a long moment, she stood there, framed by the doorway, a living reminder of a part of Edward and Lillian Carter's life they had carefully kept at the margins. The Carters had built a legacy of community service, faith, and family, but not all family stories made it into the official narrative. And yet here she was, not as an interruption, not as an apology, but as a fact that refused to be edited out. She took a steady breath, the scent of lilies sharp in her nostrils, and moved down the aisle, each step clicking softly against the polished floor. Her heels were not high enough to be haughty, but not low enough to suggest submission. Deliberate, balanced, certain, she passed pews filled with faces that flickered between sympathy and discomfort. She saw Benjamin, blonde hair graying at the temples, sitting with his arms tightly crossed, his jaw set hard. Samuel beside him, eyes downcast, fiddling with the program in his lap. Neither offered her a seat in the front. That was fine. Elena had never expected an invitation. Instead, she made her way toward the second-to-last pew and slid in silently. Her movements composed, practiced. She folded her hands in her lap, her back straight, her head held high. The service had not yet started. A murmur of conversation continued around her, low and fragmented, as if the room itself wasn't sure how to process her presence. But Elena sat untouched by it all. She wasn't here to be seen. She was here for herself. For the 7-year-old girl who had once clutched a teddy bear too tightly on a strange new porch. For the teenager who had smiled for family photos she knew would later be cropped. For the woman she had become, not because of them, but despite them. The chapel's heavy wooden doors creaked as they swung shut behind her, the final mourners arriving. A hush fell again, deeper this time, heavier. Somewhere, an organist began to play a low, somber hymn. Elena closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself, feeling the music wrap around her ribs like a second skin. She had not come to disrupt. She had not come to confront, but she had not come to be silent either. And in the quiet flicker of stained glass light, Elena Carter, the forgotten daughter, prepared to rewrite her place in a story that had long ago tried to leave her behind. The hymn ended with a lingering note, as if the music itself hesitated to let go. A thin, silver-haired pastor shuffled to the pulpit, voice cracking with age and solemnity as he welcomed the mourners and offered the opening prayer. Heads bowed, eyes closed. Elena bowed hers too. Though her mind was not on the prayer, it was drifting backward, slipping through the seams of time, back to a hallway bathed in soft afternoon light. She was 7 years old again, standing in the Carter family's sprawling colonial home, white shutters, wraparound porch. A lawn so perfectly trimmed it looked artificial. In her tiny hands, she clutched a battered backpack and a teddy bear with one glass eye missing. Lillian Carter had knelt in front of her then, all pearls and perfume, flashing a smile so polished it almost blinded. "From now on, you're one of us," Lillian had said, her voice syrupy sweet. Edward Carter, tall and ruddy-faced, had ruffled Elena's tightly coiled hair with a chuckle. "We don't see color in this house," he had declared with the booming certainty of a man who believed it. At 7, Elena didn't understand the weight of those words. She only heard family. She had believed them. The sound of pages rustling pulled her back to the present. Mourners flipped through the funeral programs, admiring the collage of glossy photographs printed inside. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, Easter Sundays, beach vacations. Benjamin and Samuel grinning, arms slung around each other. Lillian and Edward in matching golf attire, beaming. The golden retriever, Max, tail wagging in the foreground. Elena's face was nowhere to be found. She traced the empty spaces between those images with her eyes, spaces where she had been present but not preserved. Spaces where a girl could live under a roof, share meals, attend church, and still somehow remain invisible. A ripple of laughter broke out softly as someone near the front whispered about Edward's infamous Thanksgiving turkey disaster when he had dropped the entire bird onto the kitchen floor. Benjamin was already chuckling before the story was finished, as if the past wrapped itself easily around him, snug and unbroken. Elena remembered that Thanksgiving too. She remembered being told to sit at the kids' table long after she had aged out of it. She remembered Lillian guiding her gently but firmly out of the family photo for the holiday card. "We just want one with the boys this year," Lillian had said, smoothing Elena's hair as if that softened the exclusion. It hadn't. The pastor droned on about Edward and Lillian's community work, their endless generosity, their boundless love for their family. Elena sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face serene. If anyone looked closely, they might think she was proud, grateful. Even, they wouldn't see the girl who had once knelt in the dark, praying to be chosen not out of pity, but out of love. She didn't blame the mourners. Not really. They only knew the curated version of the Carters, the Instagram posts, the Sunday smiles, the casserole deliveries and PTA meetings. They didn't see the small cruelties, the careful erasures, the constant reminder that grateful was the highest emotion Elena was allowed to feel. Gratitude for being tolerated, gratitude for being fed, gratitude for being included when convenient. Another hymn began, low and mournful. Elena's gaze drifted toward the urns at the front of the chapel. Edward and Lillian Carter, two people she had once loved with the desperation only abandoned children understand. Two people who had promised her family and delivered something smaller, hollower. Yet she had come, not to seek acceptance, not to rewrite history, but to honor the truth of her own journey. And tucked deep inside her purse, crinkled from nights of folding and unfolding, was the letter that no one in this room knew existed. The letter that would, in a matter of minutes, shatter the perfect narrative everyone else had come here to mourn. Elena lowered her eyes again, letting the music wash over her. She could feel the shift coming, like the air before a summer storm, the kind that breaks the heat and demands to be acknowledged. And when it came, she would meet it standing tall. The wooden pews groaned softly as the congregation shifted, settling in for the series of eulogies that would string together a polished version of Edward and Lillian Carter's life, gleaming like glass. Fragile as lies. Benjamin stood first, straightening his tailored black jacket with the briskness of a man accustomed to being listened to. His blonde hair was grayer now, but he still carried the easy confidence of a golden child. A man who had never needed to question whether he belonged. He approached the podium, cleared his throat, and smiled the practiced smile of someone delivering a keynote address rather than mourning. Dad was a man of principle. Benjamin began, voice firm, resonant. He taught us about fairness, about standing tall in the face of adversity, about treating everyone with dignity. Elena sat motionless in the second-to-last pew, her hands clasped in her lap. To an outsider, she might have looked attentive, even touched. Inside, she felt nothing. She remembered another version of fairness the day Edward's wallet had gone missing from the kitchen counter, and how, with a tight smile and a quiet apology, Edward had asked only Elena to empty her pockets. It's just a formality. Sweetheart, you know we have to be sure. At 12 years old, Elena had done it, had turned out her pockets, her small hands trembling because somewhere deep down, she still wanted to be trusted, to be loved. The memory throbbed behind her ribs now, invisible but relentless. Benjamin continued, recounting fishing trips, late-night talks on the back porch. The lessons in integrity and honor passed from father to son. Each word floated like a feather into the chapel air. So light, so easy. No one mentioned who was left behind on those fishing trips. No one mentioned the porch swing where Elena had sat alone, forgotten. While Edward toasted marshmallows with his boys, the congregation nodded, smiled sadly, dabbed their eyes. Then it was Samuel's turn. Younger by 3 years, Samuel was less polished than his brother, a little softer around the edges, his grief more raw. He approached the microphone with a crumpled handkerchief in his hand, his voice shaking as he spoke. Mom had this way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the world, he said, blinking rapidly. She loved us fiercely, protected us, made sure we knew we were never alone. Elena listened, a small smile ghosting across her lips, not of humor, not of bitterness, but of recognition. Samuel wasn't lying. Lillian had loved fiercely but selectively. There were nights when Elena had stood outside Lillian's bedroom door, hearing laughter ripple from within, too timid to knock, too desperate to be invited in. There were birthday parties where she had helped blow up the balloons, but wasn't allowed in the group photos afterward. There were family dinners where her plate was served last. Her stories met with polite smiles and drifting eyes. Protected, only when it was convenient, never when it was costly. Samuel's voice cracked mid-sentence, and a few mourners sniffled audibly. Touched by his sincerity, Elena remained still. Her mourning had happened years ago, in stolen moments no one else had seen, in invisible wounds no one else had tended. The family the mourners remembered was not the family she had lived with. It wasn't a lie. Exactly. It was an edited version, a careful curation of memories where Elena had been blurred out, cropped away, or simply forgotten altogether. And sitting here, hearing the clean, bright fairy tale of the Carters being spun around her like spider silk, Elena realized something profound. They hadn't just left her out of the pictures. They had left her out of the story. And yet, she was still here, still standing, still ready, because in the hidden folds of her purse, pressed like a secret against her heart, was a letter ink smudged, but words clear that would reclaim her place, not as a footnote, not as a guest, but as the truth that refused to stay buried. Elena lifted her gaze to the front of the chapel. where Benjamin and Samuel stood proud and broken in their grief. They didn't know. Not yet. But they would. And when they did, they would finally have to see her, not the version they had tolerated, but the reality they had tried so hard to erase. The music swelled again as Samuel stepped down, and the pastor returned to the pulpit, inviting the congregation into silent prayer. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the storm gathering inside her. She wasn't angry. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. The last prayer drifted upward like smoke, thin and quickly swallowed by the cavernous stillness of the chapel. The congregation remained bowed in somber posture, but Elena sat upright, her eyes open, her hands steady in her lap. She could feel it now, the moment rising inside her, inevitable and solid, like the pull of the tide. Her fingers brushed lightly over the small purse resting against her hip. Inside, folded and refolded until the creases felt like scars, was the letter, the one she had found by accident or perhaps by fate when clearing out Lillian's belongings weeks earlier. It had been tucked at the back of an old jewelry box, hidden beneath tangles of pearls and forgotten brooches. An envelope yellowed with age, her name written across the front in Lillian's graceful, looping hand. Elena. No middle name, no last name, just Elena. As if, even in secret, Lillian had wanted to speak directly to the girl she had failed, not the adopted daughter, not the charity case, but the child she had never truly embraced out loud. The day Elena read the letter for the first time, she had sat on the edge of her bed for hours, the words burning through her, undoing knots she hadn't even realized she still carried. It wasn't a long letter, but it was enough. Enough to validate every ache she had swallowed in silence. Enough to strip away the varnish of the family mythology she had been expected to uphold. Enough to remind her that her pain had been real, not imagined. Not exaggerated real. Lillian's words, shaky and uneven in places, had been a confession, an apology too late to be spoken, but not too late to be heard. I was scared. Lillian had written, scared of facing what loving you fully would demand of me, scared of the whispers, the judgments, even within our own home. You deserved better. I am sorry. I see you now. Even if I never showed it properly when it mattered most. A few pews ahead, Benjamin whispered something to Samuel, both of them glancing around the chapel with the practiced ease of men who assumed control of every room they entered. They were relaxed, complacent, still living in the version of events where they were the unquestioned center of the story. They didn't know. Not yet. Elena's thumb pressed against the flap of the purse, feeling the faint crackle of the letter's edges. It would have been so easy, so familiar to stay seated, to keep the peace, to let them have their neat, sanitized goodbye, to slip away after the service, as forgettable as they had always hoped she would be. But that was the old Elena. The Elena who learned to smile when excluded. The Elena who learned to shrink to fit the space she was given. That Elena had laid herself to rest long before Lillian and Edward's urns ever reached this chapel. The woman sitting here now carried a different kind of silence inside her, not the silence of erasure, but the silence that precedes a voice finding its strength. Elena inhaled deeply, the scent of lilies and polished wood sharp and grounding. She thought of the little girl she had once been standing at the edge of family photos, clutching her teddy bear tighter when no one said her name. She thought of the teenager who had smiled through birthday songs sung around cakes she hadn't been asked to help bake. She thought of the young woman who had watched her brothers receive congratulations and invitations, while she was left holding coats and carrying the weight of invisibility. And she thought of the woman she had fought to become scarred. Yes, but still standing, still dignified, still here. The organ music shifted into a low, concluding note. The pastor moved forward again to announce the final blessing. It was now or never. Before her courage could curdle into hesitation, Elena shifted her weight forward and rose from the pew. The faint creak of wood under her heels was louder than the hymn. Heads turned. Benjamin's brow furrowed in confusion. Samuel stiffened. Elena didn't flinch. One step. Another. The letter was warm in her hand now, as if it had been waiting for this moment too. The chapel, once so heavy with scripted mourning, seemed to tilt around her, the weight of unspoken truths pulling every gaze toward the woman they had tried for so long to overlook. Elena walked toward the podium, each step deliberate, each breath steady, not hurried, not hesitant, certain. And as she climbed the shallow steps and stood behind the wooden lectern, she didn't see herself reflected in their wary eyes. She saw herself reflected in the quiet strength of her own spine, in the steady rhythm of her heart, in the unbreakable bond between the girl she had been and the woman she had become. Elena Carter, the daughter they had hidden, the sister they had sidelined. The truth they had buried had come to speak, and nothing would ever be the same again. The polished wood of the podium was cool under Elena's fingertips as she placed her hands lightly on either side, grounding herself. A hush had fallen over the chapel. Not the rehearsed silence of a funeral service, but a raw, bracing quiet, the kind that blooms when something sacred and dangerous is about to be spoken. Rows of faces stared back at her, caught between confusion, curiosity, and the flickering anxiety of those who sensed that a story they thought they understood was about to be rewritten. At the front row, Benjamin leaned slightly forward, his brows knitted together in a tight line. Samuel's lips pressed into a thin, hard slash across his face. Neither brother blinked. Elena didn't clear her throat. She didn't shuffle her notes or adjust the microphone like so many others had. She simply stood there calm, unwavering, as if she had been preparing for this moment her whole life. And in many ways, she let the silence stretch until it became a living thing between her and the audience, heavy, pulsing, demanding attention. Then, in a voice that was neither loud nor soft, but anchored, whole, she spoke. I was 7 years old when I first walked through the Carter's front door. The words floated into the still air, landing with a soft but undeniable weight. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others held their breath, waiting. Elena's eyes scanned the room slowly, not accusing, not pleading, simply witnessing. I remember the smell of Mom's perfume, lilacs and vanilla. I remember Dad's laugh, loud and sudden, like a thunderclap. I remember feeling, for the first time in a long time, like maybe I had found a place to belong. She paused, letting the simple truth settle into the cracks between pews and programs and polite memories. No one moved. Growing up, things weren't always easy, she continued, her tone even, almost gentle. Sometimes love was given in ways that were hard to recognize. Sometimes it wasn't given at all. The words were soft, but they carved through the air like knives. There was no anger in her voice, no self-pity, only the clean, aching clarity of someone speaking from a place beyond grievance, from a place of truth. From the corner of her eye, Elena saw a woman in the third pew, a former neighbor, Mrs. Parker, lower her gaze to her lap, her knuckles whitening around the funeral program. She remembered Mrs. Parker, remembered how she had once leaned down at a neighborhood barbecue and whispered, "You're such a lucky little girl to have been taken in." Lucky. As if survival was charity. As if existing under their roof was the prize. There were moments, Elena said now, her voice steady, when I wondered if I was invisible. Moments when I wondered if being told, "We don't see color," it also meant not seeing me. The silence cracked slightly. A cough muffled hastily in the back. Benjamin shifted in his seat, arms tightening across his chest. Samuel stared at the floor, jaw set. But Elena didn't flinch. She had spent too many years second-guessing her own experiences. Too many years wondering if she was being too sensitive, too needy, too much. No more. Not today. But I'm not here to rewrite the past, Elena said, her hands still resting lightly on the podium, her posture unbreakable. I am here because no matter how complicated it was, they were my family too. For a brief, painful heartbeat. Her voice softened almost imperceptibly. Not enough to break, just enough to let the truth breathe. And every child deserves to be seen, to be known, to be loved not in appearances, not in obligation, but in the quiet spaces where real love lives. She let the words linger, saturating the room like the scent of lilies thick in the air. The silence that answered her was not empty. It was full of all the things that had never been said, all the acknowledgments that had been swallowed out of fear, or guilt, or shame. And then, slowly, Elena reached toward her purse, her fingers brushing over the leather like an invocation. She drew out the envelope small, worn, trembling slightly in the air, and held it up. The congregation seemed to lean forward unconsciously, the room breathing with her. After Mom passed, I found a letter, Elena said quietly. A letter she wrote for me. Gasps flickered through the chapel. Too soft to disrupt the gravity of the moment, but sharp enough to be felt. Elena unfolded the paper with deliberate care, smoothing its creases with reverence, as if she were unfolding a wound she had carried alone for too long. And in a voice steady as stone, she began to read. Elena's fingers brushed the fragile letter open, smoothing the worn pages with a reverence that no one could mistake. The parchment trembled slightly in her hands, but her voice when it came was unshaken. My dearest Elena, she read, her tone clear, carrying through the stillness like a prayer. The congregation stiffened, instinctively aware they were no longer mere mourners. They were witnesses, witnesses to something raw, real, and irreversible. Elena continued, each word slicing through the curated grief that had blanketed the room. I am sorry. 2 words. 2 simple words that crashed like a thunderclap across the chapel. Somewhere, a throat cleared. A chair creaked. The polished air of the funeral shattered in places too small to see, but too large to ignore. Elena did not pause. She carried on, voice even. I am sorry for the times I stayed silent when you were hurt. I am sorry for the moments I chose peace over your protection. For the times I told myself love was enough when action was needed. Benjamin shifted in his seat, a muscle ticking in his jaw. Samuel leaned back, arms folded tightly across his chest, his gaze locked somewhere far away. Elena's eyes flickered briefly toward them, not with triumph, but with a sad, steady acknowledgement. They had never imagined this day would come, but Elena was not reading for them. She was reading for herself. For the little girl who had once swallowed her pain in exchange for a seat at a table that had always wobbled under the weight of pretense. You were the bravest one in this family. Elena read on. And I should have stood beside you, not behind you. I let my own fears of judgment, of scandal, of conflict, rob you of what you deserved most. Unconditional belonging. A woman 2 pews ahead, a former family friend, perhaps pressed a hand to her mouth, her shoulders trembling. Tears pricked at the edges of some eyes, glistening reflections of a truth too long ignored. Elena's voice grew even steadier, threading the air with a quiet kind of thunder. I see now that pretending not to see color was not love. It was blindness. It asked you to be small so that we could be comfortable. It asked you to silence parts of yourself to fit into a picture we were too afraid to expand. The words hung heavy, pressing down on the rows of mourners, pinning them to their seats with the weight of collective guilt and complicity. No one moved. No one dared. For the first time, Elena was not the outsider at her own story. She was the center, and the story was being retold truthfully. Finally, she drew a slow, steady breath and turned to the final part of the letter. The part that would shift the room from discomfort to outright shock. I have made arrangements. Elena read, her voice like a thread pulling open a seam, so that the home you first walked into, the place where you tried so hard to belong, will always belong to you. The words fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending silent ripples outward. Gasps broke through the stunned air. Whispers rose, frantic and disbelieving. Like birds startled from a tree, heads snapped toward Benjamin and Samuel, whose faces were masks of disbelief tight, pale, disbelieving. Elena did not look at them. She did not need to. Their reactions stunned. Brittle were answer enough. She folded the letter with slow, careful hands, almost tender, as if tucking away a living thing. Then she placed it back into her purse, a gesture of both protection and finality. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but no less commanding. Mom left me the house. A final tremor shook the room. Gasps, sharp inhales, eyes darting from brother to brother, from pew to pew, looking for something solid to cling to. Elena remained still, composed, unbreakable. She had dropped the stone of truth into their glass sea, and now they would have to live with the fractures it caused. Not because she sought vengeance, not because she needed validation, but because, finally, she had chosen herself. For a long, stretched moment after Elena's final words, the chapel remained frozen in a silence so heavy it seemed almost tangible, a thick, living thing wrapping itself around every pew, every heartbeat. No one moved. No one spoke. Not even the pastor, who stood near the pulpit with his hands clasped helplessly in front of him, his mouth slightly agape. Elena stood behind the podium, her hands resting lightly on its edges, absorbing the fullness of the moment. She felt it, the weight of years unspoken, the invisible chains breaking link by link. And yet, despite the sharp intake of breaths, the darting glances, the quickening pulse of whispered scandal, Elena's face remained serene. She did not smirk. She did not cry. She did not revel. This was not about triumph. This was about truth. Finally, she stepped back from the podium, not hurriedly, not in shame, but with the quiet, deliberate grace of someone who knew exactly who she was. Her heels clicked softly against the polished wood floor as she turned to face the congregation one last time. Some of the mourners looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Others stared openly, their faces a complicated tangle of admiration, guilt, and dawning respect. Benjamin sat rigid in his seat, arms crossed, face an unreadable mask of simmering anger and wounded pride. Samuel looked smaller somehow, folded into himself, as if the words had hollowed him out from the inside. Good. Let them sit with it. Let them finally feel the discomfort she had carried alone for so many years. But Elena had not stood up to punish them. She had not read the letter to shame them. She had done it for the little girl who had once prayed to be seen, for the young woman who had longed for a love deep enough to claim her without conditions, for herself, and for the family they could have been but chose not to be. She took one final breath, letting it fill her lungs like light. Then, with a voice softer than before, but somehow more powerful for its restraint, she said, "I didn't come here today for revenge." The words were like stones skipping across still water, gentle, but impossible to ignore. I came because even imperfect love deserves to be acknowledged. I came because truth deserves a voice even when it's inconvenient, even when it's uncomfortable. Her eyes swept slowly across the room, across the bowed heads, the tight shoulders, the hands twisted in programs folded too many times to count. And then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if sealing something within herself, Elena turned away from the podium. She did not wait for permission. She did not wait for applause. She did not wait for forgiveness. She walked slowly, steadily, back down the center aisle, the same path she had walked hours earlier, the same path she had spent a lifetime crossing in ways unseen. Each step felt lighter than the last, as if a weight she hadn't even realized she still carried was lifting from her shoulders. At the second-to-last pew, she slid silently into her seat once more, folding her hands neatly in her lap. The congregation remained paralyzed, the silence inside the chapel louder than any hymn, deeper than any eulogy. Because the story they had come to tell, the easy, polished story of Edward and Lillian Carter, had been cracked open. And inside that crack, real light had poured through, the light of truth, the light of acknowledgement, the light of a daughter once hidden, now seen. And whether they liked it or not, nothing would ever be the same again. For a few long seconds after Elena returned to her seat, the chapel remained perfectly still, a silence so full it felt like a physical weight pressing down on every chest. And then, like cracks spidering through glass, the stillness began to break. First, a whisper sharp, sibilant somewhere in the third row. Then another, hushed but urgent. Heads turned. Eyes darted between pews. The congregation had come expecting grief wrapped in neat hymns and polished memories. Instead, they had been handed a raw, unedited truth, and they didn't know what to do with it. Some glanced furtively at Benjamin and Samuel, as if searching for cues on how to react. Benjamin sat rigid, his jaw tight enough to splinter teeth, his hands gripping the edges of the pew. His face, once polished with the easy charm of a favored son, was now a mask of simmering fury. Samuel looked different, small, uncertain. He stared blankly at the altar, as if hoping he could will himself elsewhere, in the front near the urns. The family's longtime attorney, Mr. Garrison, a stooped man with thinning gray hair and an ever-present leather briefcase, leaned toward them, whispering urgently. Benjamin shook his head sharply, lips pressed into a thin line. Samuel merely nodded once, stiffly, as if unable to fully process the words being spoken to him. Elena sat back against the pew, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She watched it all unfold without a flicker of emotion on her face. She had expected this. The scrambling, the disbelief, the bargaining that would inevitably follow. They were not mourning the loss of the house. They were mourning the loss of the illusion, the carefully constructed fiction that had kept them safely at the center of their family's story. And now, exposed under the bright glare of truth, the cracks could no longer be polished away. Some mourners were now whispering openly, their faces turned toward Elena with expressions ranging from shock to something like shame. A few brave or perhaps guilty offered her small, uncertain smiles. Most did not. They weren't ready. Maybe they never would be. But Elena hadn't spoken for them. She hadn't peeled back old wounds to earn their pity or their validation. She had done it for herself. For the girl who had once been told to step aside for family photos. For the teenager who had been asked to be grateful while swallowing loneliness whole. For the woman who now understood that truth was its own form of love, fierce, unvarnished, and utterly necessary. The pastor, looking visibly rattled, cleared his throat and attempted to steer the service back on course, offering a final prayer. His voice quivered slightly, the words stumbling over themselves. The congregation bowed their heads again, but the energy had shifted. The prayer rang hollow now, like an afterthought. The real sermon had already been delivered. And it hadn't come from the pulpit. It had come from the back of the room, where the forgotten daughter had stepped forward and dared to be seen. As the final amen echoed across the chapel, people began to rise slowly, uncertainly, like swimmers breaking through the surface after being underwater too long. Elena remained seated for a moment longer, letting the moment settle into her bones. Around her, conversations flared in low, urgent tones. Benjamin was speaking to Mr. Garrison now, gesturing sharply, his face flushed with an anger he couldn't quite contain. Samuel stood beside them, his arms hanging limply at his sides, as if the strength had been drained from him. Neither of them looked toward Elena. Neither of them dared. They were too busy trying to salvage whatever pieces of their narrative still remained intact. And Elena, she didn't need to salvage anything. She had already claimed the only thing that mattered. Her truth, her voice, her rightful place, and no amount of scrambling or whispered scandal could ever take that from her again. The final amen had barely faded when the congregation began to stir, not with the solemn grace expected at a funeral, but with the nervous, disjointed energy of people desperate to flee something they didn't know how to face. People rose stiffly from their pews, fumbling for purses and programs, murmuring hasty goodbyes that sounded more like apologies than condolences. No one rushed to Benjamin or Samuel now. The magnetic pull they once commanded had fractured, replaced by an awkward halo of hesitation. The family, so carefully crafted, so painstakingly polished, no longer gleamed under the public gaze. It had cracks now, deep, undeniable cracks, and everyone could see them. Benjamin stood rigid at the front of the chapel, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. His jaw worked silently, as if grinding through 1,000 furious words he dared not say out loud, not here, not now. Samuel hovered near him, pale and slack-eyed, nodding numbly as Mr. Garrison spoke to them in low, urgent tones. Papers shifted hands. Legal jargon buzzed like flies. Too late. Elena didn't watch them long. They were no longer the axis around which her world spun. She rose from her pew, slow, unhurried, smoothing the skirt of her simple black dress with a small, absent gesture. A few mourners turned to look at her as she stood, some with guilt, some with something closer to awe. None dared to approach. Elena offered polite nods to those whose gazes she caught, but no more. She owed no explanations, no performances, no more pieces of herself. Moving with the same quiet dignity that had carried her to the podium, Elena made her way down the center aisle, each step away from the pews, away from the urns, away from the polished facade of the Carter's legacy, felt lighter than the last. When she reached the heavy wooden doors at the back of the chapel, she paused for a brief moment. She turned, just slightly, casting one final glance across the room, not with sadness, not with anger, with gratitude, not for what they had given her, but for what they had failed to give, because their refusal to truly see her had forced her to see herself. And that was a gift far greater than any inheritance. Elena pushed open the door, and sunlight flooded over her like a blessing. The air outside was warm and bright, the breeze lifting the hem of her dress and the edges of her hair in soft, playful currents. She stepped into it, into the wide, open world that had always waited beyond their narrow story. For a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the sun kiss her skin, letting the gentle wind tangle her hair. She was free, not because the house now belonged to her, not because of some overdue apology penned in fading ink, but because she had spoken. She had claimed her place. She had ended the story they tried to tell about her and begun her own. Behind her, the chapel doors creaked shut. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her story no longer lived in that room. It lived in her steps, in her breath, in her name, Elena Carter, daughter, survivor, author of her own life. And as she walked down the stone steps into the blaze of afternoon sunlight, her heart was unburdened, her spine straight, her spirit fierce. The past had tried to erase her. The future would remember her, because she and she alone had finished the story. The gravel crunched softly under Elena's shoes as she crossed the parking lot, each step carrying her further away from the life she had once tried so desperately to fit into. The afternoon sun blazed high overhead now, casting everything in sharp, brilliant relief, no shadows to hide behind, no soft corners to blur the truth. She reached her car, an old, steady sedan, paint slightly faded, worn like a trusted friend, and slipped inside. The door closed with a quiet click that seemed to seal the past behind her. For a moment, Elena simply sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring out across the chapel steps where mourners clustered in small, uneasy groups. Benjamin and Samuel were among them, their stiff backs turned toward her, shoulders hunched in urgent conversation with Mr. Garrison. She didn't care what they were plotting. The estate, the inheritance, the whispers. None of it mattered anymore. They could scramble all they wanted to reclaim the story. They could try to rewrite, reframe, repackage, but the truth had been spoken. And it had been heard, maybe not by everyone, maybe not even by themselves, but it was out there now, breathing, living, unerasable. Elena reached into her purse and pulled out the letter once more. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing the fragile creases, letting her eyes trace the familiar lines of Lillian's shaky apology. "You were the bravest one in this family." She read the words again, but this time, they didn't sting. They didn't ache. They felt complete, acknowledged, seen. For years, Elena had carried the weight of invisibility, like a stone in her chest. Today, she had put it down, not because someone gave her permission, not because she had finally been granted a seat at their table, but because she had built her own table with her own voice, her own truth, her own fierce, unbreakable dignity. She folded the letter one last time and placed it gently back into her purse. Then, she started the car. The engine rumbled to life, steady and sure. She pulled out of the parking lot without a glance in the rearview mirror. The chapel, the urns, the mourners. The old story grew smaller behind her. Ahead, the road stretched wide and open, shimmering in the golden afternoon light. The world awaited. Her life awaited. Not the life they had offered, small, conditional, clipped at the wings, but a life fully her own. She smiled a real smile, deep and quiet, the kind that started not at the mouth, but somewhere in the bones. And as the car picked up speed, as the wind tangled gently through the open window and the sun painted her skin in gold, Elena whispered not to anyone else, but to herself. "I never needed their permission to belong. I have always belonged to myself." And with that, Elena Carter, once forgotten, once hidden, once nearly erased, drove forward into a future she no longer feared, into a life she no longer apologized for, into a story only she could finish, and she had finished it beautifully,